hopefully this is live and hopefully everybody can hear me. And what I'm really hoping for, this has gone live on our friend's channel as well. Alex, hopefully he'll tell me when he comes back on whether it's live or not. I'm actually gonna, good evening all, good evening everybody. Yes, I know. Here I am, hello. Yes, now normally I'll play some music at the beginning. I'm not gonna do that for simple reason. This may be streaming directly to Alex Thompson's YouTube channel as well. Not because it will cause any problems, because it won't. It's our rendition of Free Me. But you do get a notice from YouTube that says this is potentially, but because it's our rendition, there's no copyright strike on it at all, right? And we can actually share it if we wanted to and get revenue. I don't bother doing that because they start censoring you in all sorts of strange ways. So I will be coming back up there, and I will be, you should be able to see on the screen in front of you, we have someone waiting there. Look, so I'm going to click the button in a couple of minutes and get Alex to come in. So again, don't forget to share this. That's part of my problem at the moment. Let me bring this back down to this. Oh, let me jump it up on there. And I should be able to share it myself. Like, share, really important to share because you're the people getting this out there. I'm going to put in there live now and then put it back on the main screen. I have to put it back on a small screen to get this information out there. There it is on Facebook. About to send it out. Not sure if it's going to be on VK. Because I actually done some shenanigans with the settings before I did it, so hopefully everybody's out there, and we're going to see what it's like. So touch wood, I am now I've shared it and liked it, I am going to bring it back up on there. I'm going to bring down the screen. Touch wood, I have muted. So everyone should be hearing this, and what I'm going to do now is go over to Alex. So hopefully you'll be seeing Alex on the screen in a couple of seconds. Alex!
Hello Graham, good to see you.
And you. And your sound is working and you're not muted, which is absolutely fantastic. Do love the windmill.
Yeah, you do get other kinds of people joining who don't know how to do these things, but yeah, it's working well.
Hang on, let me just make sure they're all hearing us in the background. Can I get a 5x5 from everyone on the chat and tell me if everyone can see it? And by the way, I've shared this to your channel, so I'm hoping that that's worked.
There we are. Let me just refresh my own channel and see. Oh, it's working. Brilliant stuff.
Good. Well, that's what I like to hear. Right, okay, so I'll give the introductions basically. Alex is a contributor, if I can describe you as that, with the UK column. Obviously myself, most people would know, but for your channel, if you don't know who I am an English constitutionalist, right? So I'm not a politician. I'm not really interested in politics as we've got it in this country at the moment. I'm a constitutionalist. I literally look after people's rights. In other words, I protect them, whereas politicians invariably are there to remove them as much as they can, and that's what they have been doing. So again, Alex, if you want to, give yourself an introduction, what your previous roles have been, etc.
So, I hate starting with so, it's very American. All right then. I'm an only child and fairly intellectual in my upbringing, and was very interested in questions of who rules us and how from an early age. I remember speaking about that with my parents at a time when most kids of my age were more interested in playing. Went to boarding school, rubbed shoulders with the elite, found out what little bastards they were, and was at school with the grandsons more particularly, of some of the worst politicians in the land and businessmen. On to Cambridge, more disappointment there. I was actually, as a student, an attender of Torquil Dick Erickson's explosive debate with a man whose name escapes me on Corpus Juris that was held in Cambridge. So if people look up Corpus Juris debate Cambridge, they'll probably find that on YouTube just from that, because Torquil Dick Ericsson's a difficult name to spell. But if you look at video 3 of 4, I'm in there to about 3/4 of the way through, saying in, what would it be, 1998, what's this principle of subsidiarity? We might get around to discussing that later, because I think it's relevant to the debate we're having now. So I was very concerned about these issues even then. Then I went to the former Soviet Union. It was already the former by that point. Came back, had languages, joined GCHQ, which is Britain's sister agency to NSA, Electronics and Signals Intelligence. Was there till 2009. And the reason I've got windmills behind me is because I left to marry a Dutch girl. And from there, I started getting very concerned indeed, particularly about child abuse. And from that, I gravitated towards the UK column, which I quickly worked out was the most serious, level-headed, and I would say daring of the people discussing that issue at that point, and who weren't making false claims or narrowing in on just one part of the problem. So I was behind the camera, and then from about 2015, I've been in front of the camera, being their Europe correspondent. And more recently, I've become a formal student of comparative constitutional law, which is jolly hard to find any courses in, whether in Britain, America, or on the continent. Almost nobody does academic courses in comparative constitutional law because the legal fraternities do not like to admit that they don't know it well enough. They hardly know their own jurisdiction well enough, and they certainly don't know, if they're in a civil law country like here in the Netherlands, they don't know the common law well enough to teach it. But even US and British universities are not actually teaching that issue. So I'm having to work my way in from the side, but I'll hope to take that to a high academic level.
Right. Well, that's interesting that you talk about the academic side of constitutionality. I'm not particularly... and we'll get straight into this element from your what you've just said there. Let me just say this to everyone. I'm not interested at all with other people's constitutions. There's only 2 constitutions that I'm interested in, and that's because one of them stems from ours, which is the American Constitution, and the English Constitution. Anything else is peripheral to that. They can do what they like. The people I'm interested in are the English, yeah. And whilst I love the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh, Wales is part of us. If they want to have a referendum and pull away and be their own country, I've not got an issue with that. And I think, to be honest with you, and I've said this on this show many times, the only way that you will force people into think about who they're voting for is when they are completely independent, and you will see the SNP and the likes of the socialists in Scotland disappear, because people will realise we can either go down a pan and a plug hole of a socialist system, or we can, recreate Scotland from the eyes of Sir John James Coffaway, which he was the one who kept the British out of Hong Kong and created such a successful area in Asia, mainly because of his positive non-interventionism, which was a policy that I absolutely believe in. So one of the things that I'm going to do, Alex, first of all, just to let you know, anyone who's worked for GCHQ, I haven't got a lot of trust in, right? It's not pointed at you, but let me tell you something. 30 years ago, they and the police were using methods against, let's just say, domestic criminals, right? And that was that they were spying on people in their homes through the satellite systems, and in particular, they were using the skyboxes. So, and the reason this all come out was because I was arrested on a complete scam and hoax of a case. That's when I went to prison for a long time, and it was a load of BS, right? Now, I'm just going to say this to you. You're an intelligent man. I'm going to say this to you. This is what they said that I did. On a laptop, I broke banking encryption, right? So that's the case they put forward, and that's the BS that they put to a judge with a load of other stuff there. So what I'm trying to say to you is, everyone I've ever spoke to, have said what, and they believe that. And
Banking encryption is often better than intelligence services encryption, and some of my mates at Cambridge went off into the city, and I found that they had better document security protocols, physical and digital, than we did.
Yeah.
Because the beast that you would call the British, and I think we at UK Column are gunning at the same target, but we have other names for it. Yeah. They have more interest in the money than they do in the people.
I agree entirely, which is one of the reasons that they put me behind a door as a triple Cat A and a double Cat A, classed me as a terrorist,
Good heavens.
For the simple reason that my intelligence they didn't like. And they didn't like the fact that I was having a go at their banking system.
I think it's particularly, Graham, that you take an engineering mind to it, because you were praising David Ellis yesterday, and I'm in awe of both of the Davids, both of our engineers, different branches of engineering. Yeah. And I've actually taken their wisdom and applied it, I hope, in a humble way to the law, and also in my language teaching. I teach the classical languages in Bible schools and the like. Yeah. And I'm finding that taking an engineering view cuts through a lot of the crap which has been put there deliberately to keep people from seeing the whole of the system.
Agreed. And one of the things of my background is that I was an engineer in telecommunications. I fully understand telecommunications, global telecoms, data communications, BGP, writing the code. How do
your ilk is not allowed to exist independent of the system. That's the problem you've got.
Yeah. So at the end result of this is I ended up researching law, and if you like, from an engineering system, because I wanted to know how it functioned, why it functioned, where a constitution come from, what does a constitution do, how did the Queen get where the Queen was, or how does a president get where a president is? And the answer is, and I've said this on many occasions, it doesn't matter whether it's a president or a Queen, whether it's a monarchy or a republic, the constitution runs over the top. The difference with us is we've also got what's known as common law jurisdiction.
Yes.
And a lot of people don't understand it. So
you're quite right. In fact, I made that point in the podcast that you took exception to. I said that in the Republic, I'm going to go into this in more depth, God willing, in future episodes. People in egalitarian republics think, well, they've dispensed with 2/3 of the classical triad because they don't have a crown and they don't have a nobility anymore. But they jolly well do. It's just called the presidency and the Senate. And the overall concept, they call a republic, we call a crown, is there in other countries.
Absolutely agree. And to be fair, that's what I tell people. I mean, there's a major difference. Let me just explain this to people. Between the United States of America, President Trump, for example, is using his prerogative of mercy that our Queen no longer uses. Yeah. Our Queen no longer assents to any law, since 1849, I believe it is.
Correct. I think 54 I've heard, but there's a couple of our viewers who are really keen for us to point this out as often as we can, that the Queen uses these lords called her cousins, who use this Norman French phrase, la reine revolte, which is unlawful. Since Victoria, in fact, it was Albert that probably put pressure on it. There is no proper royal assent. There's no brakes on the system.
Exactly. And so they used to call it a letter of patent. If you actually, and I've got the law books here that state it, they actually state the actual constitution and the law-making process has been subverted, right? So they've removed the Queen, in effect.
So I'll give you an example from within GCHQ, actually. Yeah. Something that got me quite jaded. I noticed, this was before there was much on the internet, particularly not much audio, video material about the Constitution, a bit of, a few odd websites, but I wasn't interested at that point, well, not to that degree. But I started getting cold feet at some points when I found that the legal advisors inside the department were talking far more about legalities than they were about lawfulness, or legal, or even legality, but legalities plural. And I pressed a bit further with the legal advisor, and I found that all the internal guidance talked about this mythical concept, UK law. And I will agree with you, Graham, UK law is a deliberately concocted phrase of very recent pedigree. right? They didn't even say British statutes or you would contest the phrase British Constitution. They didn't even say that. We always act in accordance with UK law, which is in any spook environment, it's all United Kingdom wide. There's no devolution at all, of course, which is as it should be, I would say. But anyway, I asked the legal advisor, and I remember at one point I said, what about the will of Parliament? And I got this stiff email back saying, if you have any questions about the will of Parliament, you must ask me. I thought to myself, the member for which constituency are you, mate? So obviously at that point, I would now say it's the corporate crown. Well, that's a bit Tony Benn phrase, but he identified that in 1989. A corporate crown in the Cabinet Office and its appendages, like the legal advisors in the other, hard-nosed departments, had taken over the process. So I know what you mean there.
Right. So there's a second element to that. So I'm just going to show you something now, which is an examination, just to show you. First of all, I haven't got a degree. I'm not interested in degrees. I didn't go to school very often because I didn't like being programmed by them people. When I look back now, I can see what they was doing, and I realise why I didn't like it. I educated myself mainly from reading legal documentation, and I always go back. I'm going to show you some things in a minute. I always go back to the originals, but there is a pamphlet, right? It's an original. It looks
Sweet and Maxwell, yeah, they're brilliant publishers. So many of those publishers have died the death.
Well, again, examination notebook, English legal system. See that it doesn't say British.
Correct.
English legal system by A.J. Williams, barrister at law. And then it goes into detail in this exam cram on English constitutional law. And it's very interesting. What I'm actually trying to explain to people, and this is not just for yourself, obviously, this is for people watching, yeah, they removed all of that from the curriculum at early 1970s, late 1960s, because they knew what they was doing with the European Union was unlawful, right?
In fact, half a century before they did that in the law schools, they started tinkering with Erskine May, the Guide for Parliamentarians. It's often advised that you shouldn't get an edition more recent than 1920-something, 26, I think it is.
That's it, and John Hurst often speaks about that for that specific reason. So again, this exam cram, whatever you want to describe it as, but on English constitutional law, was also removed from the bar exams, which means that as the judges come through and as the barristers take silk and then become judges, none of them are trained in constitutional law. None of them. Right?
Deliberately not. And thank you very much for finding Judge Phillips being the second or third, possibly third, Supreme Court judge. Of course, you and I would agree there is no such institution, or at least not in that form. And in fact, the law lords, when debating whether to wind themselves up into the new Supreme Court, said, we will have the title, but we won't be the Supreme Court. The real powers will be vested in the Cabinet Office. They weren't that explicit, but they were hinting at that. Yeah. Anyway, we found Judge Phillips, or you've identified in minute 48 and minute 119, that you put up yesterday of that video saying, I knew everything except common law, which is very common about, senior academic lawyers, very, very common that they have all that stuff. Human rights first, common law never, right? But on top of that, I shared with David Scott a while ago that when Lady Hale was deputy head of the Supreme Court and president, I beg your pardon, and the president was Lord Neuberger, they had a hearing with the House of Lords Judicial Committee. And Neuberger was holding forth and said, he was trying to educate the lordships, and said, in Scotland they do not have the common law, and no one less bent than Lord Cullen of the Dunblane cover-up had to butt in at the end and say, I have to correct you. Scotland has common law. It's just that it imported some Roman law doctrines into it. That's the level of ignorance in the Supreme Court.
Right. Well, and again, there's a couple of things. I mean, you've brought up. And again, this is not for you to answer, but there was a particular, from David Scott, quote, and again, it's for him to answer this, not for you, but I just want people to understand this. This is why I referenced on your podcast a Brit, a Scot and an Irishman, right? Because I didn't hear a single Englishman there, right? Whether you regard yourself as British or English.
Well, Graham, which of my parents would you like me to disown? if I say I'm English or Scottish? Because I've got one of each.
Well, you don't disown either. You decide what you decide exactly, but to call yourself British is wrong. You know, in my view,
Right?
Because it's not a country.
Let's start with not a country. I remember fiercely debating with my father, who's the Scotsman, aged 9. I said Scotland isn't a country, Dad. The wording I would use now is state and international law, right? And he said, of course, that's nonsense, because of course to him, country meant, in common parlance, country is a nation. It's an ethnic group, right? It doesn't even need to have statehood. So some people, Kurdistan is a country, for example, or Ukraine was a country when it was in the Soviet Union, that kind of thing. Okay, but let me just ask, in what year or round about what period did you come to this conviction, which is pretty unique, and I understand it as a rhetorical device, but it's pretty unique to you. Maybe you're the originator of it, that this conviction that Britain or the British were the enemy of the English Constitution. Round about when?
Well, the answer to that is I've certainly thought it the last 30 years.
Really?
And it's not, I wouldn't say it's linked, I wouldn't say it's unique to me. So I'm just going to say this to you. David Scott, funny you've just mentioned what you had a conversation with your father. So again, this is not for you to answer. I'm just going to give you a quote from one of the people that was on your podcast. He didn't say this in your podcast, but I just want you to understand what I believe his quote to be. There is no such country as England.
Did he say that in the podcast?
No, he didn't. But what I'm saying to you is that is a quote that he has made in the past. There is no such country
I saw
as
that
England.
comment flit past in the chat under your stream yesterday.
Right.
I can't speak for David, but I know that Brian Gerrish is very keen also to come on you and talk about this, although he probably would be more apt to speak about the British Constitution Group, our links with John Hurst, who I get on very well. I've called him just this week, for example, and John Bingley and that kind of issue. And the question of who are the British, he's got some questions or debate for you on that front if you're interested. Yeah. I can't speak for David Scott, but I've never heard David in, 5-6 years, I've known him pretty well, say anything like that, actually.
Right. So have you ever been in the studio of UK Column and the English question, whatever way you want to describe it, England has been brought up and it is not spoken about? They will not talk about England.
Not as such. I've only made an average of about one visit down to the studios each year since I became a formal contributor in 2015.
Right.
So I was, for example, surprised when you said in the stream that you'd called me up and I'd said, oh, no, we don't have a right to keep and bear arms. That's outdated. You called someone up, perhaps, but not me, because I still don't give legal advice, but I was, fully right to keep and bear arms then as now. And that's thanks to John Hurst, who's pointed out that the English right to keep and bear arms, which is in the English Bill of Rights and not in the Scottish Claim of Right, interestingly, otherwise similar documents, is uninfringible. But it's been infringed by policy in the 1960s by police chief connivance with the Home Office, as you pointed out. But no, I never gave that advice. And in the general, to answer your question more generally about the studio, I've been there about once a year. The last 4 or 5 years, there's been various gentlemen helping Mike with audio visuals, for example. And some of the BCG guys have been in the office from time to time. So there's an average of about 4 guys working in there at any time.
And any of them.
But I've never heard anything about let's avoid the English question, or even such that there be an English question.
Okay.
The dear lady Carol, who was office lady and answered the phones until she passed away about a year ago now, was very, very English, outspokenly so.
Okay, well, so the next thing to say to you about me ringing up, the person said his name was Alex. It sounded like you. It was a number of years ago, I can tell you that. You may have changed your mind since you spoke to John Hurst, or John Hurst has given you information on the right to keep and bear arms. But my point of this is you cannot pick and choose what rights, because it's your opinion, or anyone else, and I'm not just talking about you, I'm talking about anybody, and that includes members of Parliament. You cannot pick and choose what rights you decide we have. They're unalienable.
You're getting
rights.
to the absolute core of it now, Graham. You're getting out to the question of Parliament and rights.
Yeah.
Why is this the absolute core of it? Because, I mean, you held up the Barrister's Guide, right? The English legal system. Absolutely. There is an English legal system and there is a Scottish legal system, because the explicit terms of the Act of Union, which of course was a treaty and a statute, were that Scotland would retain its ecclesiastical, judicial and educational system.
Exactly.
There was no question about that. So I don't know whether you contest the very idea of three branches of government, which foreign observers like Montesquieu and Hegel said was so characteristically English, but they all said the English constitution is great because it has separation of powers between three branches of government. If you take those three branches, the judiciary, to this day, even with a UK Supreme Court in place, and by the way, that's quite useful when it bats away the Scottish government's named person legislation, which all the Scottish courts nodded through. That still exists, but it doesn't have ultimate jurisdiction over Scottish criminal cases. It's still a separate legal system. There is no judicial union. There is comity, respect of each other's judgments, but nothing more than that. Executive, it's Her Majesty's government. It's not Her Majesty's government in right of England and Her Majesty's government in right of Scotland, as you have Her Majesty's government in right of Canada or in right of New Zealand. Right? It's Her Majesty's government, and even now that we have a devolved Scottish government, or executive to be more correct, it's not Her Majesty's government for Scotland. It is a devolved function of the executive of Her Majesty's government. In fact, we had that unity even before the Act of Parliament. A century earlier, we had the Union of Crowns.
Yeah,
and it was after the Union of Crowns that Calvin's case found that a Scot who inherited in England could not be denied his inheritance as an alien. And the jurisprudence of that case, even though the legal systems were separate, as just mentioned, was that the rights of an Englishman devolved to a Scot and vice versa. A Scot inherited the rights of Magna Carta, as John Hurst puts it often. An Englishman inherited the rights of the Declaration of Arbroath.
Yep.
Now, the third branch is the legislature, and that is the crunch point, Graham. That is the crunch point. The mainstream position, which, shall we say, smarmy gits who dominate the system like to proffer, is that there still exists an English Parliament and a Scottish Parliament, and they choose to meet together. In fact, when the SNP was on the rise, I remember the argument being that all the 72, as it was then, Scots MPs needed to do, even if they weren't SNP, if they were just Labour and fed up with the Union, was to up sticks and meet in Holyrood again, and that would end the Union. I now realise that's a non-argument. The Treaty of Union did provide for the extinguishing of the English Parliament, although the new United Kingdom Parliament continued to meet in the same location in the Palace of Westminster. And if you look at all the formal guides, it talks about the Act of the English Parliament, Act of the Scots Parliament, and then at 1707 you get a new section, Act of the United Kingdom Parliament, a new body called into being by that treaty a century after the Act of Union. And, the drafting wasn't in error, as I used to think it was. The drafting of the Scottish Parliament Act 1998, which came into effect the next year, started off famously with the line, "There shall be a Scottish Parliament." And in my old frame of mind, I was thinking that's an error in the drafting, because there always has been. It meets at Westminster. Now I know that that's not correct. The Scottish Parliament and the English Parliament ceased to exist.
That's
the
right.
Grattan Parliament ceased to exist in 1801. There's only a UK Parliament now. So that third branch of government, the legislature, that's the tricky one, because that legislature legislates for different jurisdictions. Northern Ireland is another one that's come along with the partition as well.
Well, again.
Now, of course, a final point on that, we've got to bring Wales in. Wales started off with the devolution 20 years ago with the Senedd being called an assembly. Its acts were called measures to avoid offending people.
Yep.
They now call themselves the Welsh Government, just like the Scottish Executive in 2007 started calling themselves the Scottish Government. The Senedd Welsh measures suddenly became Welsh laws, plural. And a couple of years ago, the outgoing Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, who was a Welshman actually,
Yep.
Lord John Thomas of Cwmgiev, said at a conference to Cymru'r Gyfraith, Legal Wales Conference, that Wales was a jurisdiction. This was against the will of the Welsh, but the legal fraternity had decided Wales was a jurisdiction. It was going to compete for common law arbitration, lucrative business, Hong Kong and Singapore companies and that kind of thing. And it was a new jurisdiction. And just this week, we're now hearing that there's not just such a thing as Welsh laws, plural, but more fundamentally, there is Welsh law. And Welsh law, we're now being told this week, is dominating the life of people in Wales as never before. So the trick is always that once you go on once you have a parliament which is legislating for different jurisdictions, the mechanism, the beast can creep into the system, and you get these appendages that say, well, we are drafting the body of law, because you then get regulation, statutory instruments, all that other stuff, and then the supranational level, EU measures, ultimately UN measures as well, all coming through. And that's generalized in the singular to law. That word is suspect when you see UK law, Welsh law, because are we talking legal system or are we talking statutes?
Right. You've hit on a number of points there. What I'm going to do is drill down onto the last part of what you've said, because this is important to many people that watch my show. And by the way, as far as I'm aware, I am the only person that continuously, or a channel that is dedicated to the English Constitution, right? Everyone else seems to think they're British because they've been brainwashed into it, right? This is the point. The United Nations, do you know of something called Agenda 2030? Have you heard of that phrase?
Yes, we cover it quite a lot on UK Column.
You do indeed. And are you aware that, and you've already hit on one part of this, in effect, the UK Parliament has become almost a corporation, or a corporation within itself, managing these islands, right?
That is a part of it which I hadn't thought, but I'll go along with that gladly, without quibbling it, because the Crown, as Tony Benn and Conservative counterparts at the time said, has been spun out from a sole corporation, the sovereign on her oath, to an unlawful situation of a corporation, basically. And it stands to reason that Parliament, which people often forget is not government, it's not Her Majesty's government or the Crown, it's us.
Yeah.
Parliament is, committees of Parliament are not the government. They're not authority talking to us. They're us talking to authority. It stands to reason that, along with the corruption of the rest of the system, Parliament also should have been turned into a corporation. I wouldn't be surprised if it was one of the many that famously are listed in New York as places of business, together with all the councils.
Yep. Well, let me get back and drill down onto that. Are you aware of the legal and lawful position that if you void, I'm not talking about repealing, I'm talking about voiding in English law, the Acts of Union of 1706, 1707, that every agreement that the British have made to stitch us up is torn up. And that includes Agenda 2030.
Yes, Graham, I am right. I am aware. You are absolutely right. And I've been sitting last year in international law lectures, and over here in the Netherlands, they tend to be less corrupt. And I've been asking people, international law lecturers, about this. And their point hit home to me that all treaties are executive to executive. They are ratified by parliaments. International law requires that. And people might get het up about my use of the phrase international law, but it is only accepted shorthand for treaty law.
Yep, I agree.
International law requires ratification by parliaments if that's part of the national constitutional order on one or both sides. But once these treaties are made and the binding commitments are in place and any multilateral bodies are set up, like the whatever it may be, the OSCE, which isn't even UN, or the OPCW, then anything that's set up as a result can only speak to executives, Her Majesty's government in our case. And if it wanted to speak interestingly to Britain about abuses by the Scottish government, it would speak to Her Majesty's government in Westminster, because that again proves that we don't have full parallel executive thing. So you're absolutely right. Undoing the Act of Union would undo the United Kingdom Parliament. And we would not have, de jure, we would work it out de facto, of course, fine. We would not then have de jure an English Parliament or a Scottish Parliament left, with or without devolution. There would be no rump Parliament, because all of those MPs would be dissolved by the Crown and by the electorate as a result of their Parliament, which is a creation of a treaty, disappearing. We would obviously go back to an Anglo-Saxon solution then, but yes, you're absolutely right. I don't counsel that route because it would be throwing out the baby with the bathwater, or probably, using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And personally, for me, it would tear my identity apart. But you're right that this is a remedy.
Identity, without any doubts whatsoever, because the British identity would be gone with the Acts of Union, and that's crucially important. But I want the British identity gone, right? Because it is the British that is attacking us, and it's the British attacking England. And one of the things that irritated and angered me is that you had a Brit an Irishman and a Scotsman on your pod and not one word from an Englishman. I find that repulsive and disgusting that people should do that. And I'm being straight with you, yeah? I have a passion for my country. If you go back and look at the 2011 census, I'm not on my own. There's 37 million people that signed that census and said they was English only national identity. That tells you, and it did tell you, that the minority was people who believed they was British, right?
Doesn't surprise me. I could see that coming at boarding school.
Right.
I didn't make a big thing of being half Scots, but Thompson without a P being the spelling of my name and whatever, gives the game away to some. And there were the usual remarks about bloody Scots, get them out, whatever. But I realised that probably starting more among the working class, and in certain parts of the country, certainly along the east coast of England, it was even when I was a boy, it was much commoner for people to say they were English than British.
Nearly everyone I meet, strangely enough, even though I live in London, yeah, but my area of London is the highest English-only national identity, right? So when I say to people what nationality you are, they say English.
Well, I mean, I've lived in the Netherlands for over a decade. They always call me either an Englishman or a Scotsman over here.
Yeah, and again...
They almost never say British.
Yeah. So the first element to come back to, and again, this is the discussion. You've already said, I've said to you, are you English or British? And you've straight away retorted, so which one of my parents do I deny? The answer is you don't have to deny either parent, yeah? But what I'm telling you is I've got people in my family that are Scottish, yeah? I love the Scots, the Welsh and the Irish. Your ancestry with this is, to me, irrelevant, right? In reality, if you're an Englishman living in Holland and you pay your taxes in Holland, yeah, by some of the people that I speak to, they would say you're Dutch. They wouldn't even say you was English.
The Dutch insist that I'm Dutch for that basis, of domicile.
Domicile.
This is the civil law European tradition that's crept into Britain. But Graham, what is the basis of nationality then for you? How do you define who passes the test to be an Englishman?
The answer is so the test, if you like, for an Englishman. So the first thing you would have to do, so I'm talking about dissolving a British identity completely. I want it gone because it's attacking my country and the British socialists, and that means the Lib Dems, that means the Tories, and that also means the Labour Party. All three of them, as far as I'm concerned, are socialists attacking England, right? So
totally agreed. Oh, by the way, I heard from you and some of the commenters that I support the Labour Party. Never have. My granddad was an old Labour man, and in fact he deplored the rise of what he called the Celts: Cook, Kinnock, Brown, and Smith. I remember him saying that 30 years ago. But no,
I don't think
they all need to go. We are increasingly making this point on UK column. The whipped party system and the individual political parties are injurious to our liberty and actually repugnant to common law to have parties.
Again, that gets into, let me just say this and I'll express this to everyone, yeah? The reason why the United States of America is the most powerful nation in the world is not because it's the greatest landmass, because it isn't. And it isn't because it's got the greatest populace, because it hasn't. It's because of its adoption of the English Constitution as the basis of its Constitution.
Yeah, and Calvin's case, which confirmed that Scots and English inherited each other's rights in an augmenting way, not a diminishing way. That was a major precursor to the inheritance of the rights of Englishmen by the revolutionary colonialists.
Yeah. So when you look at so you've just hit on one of the points that I always bring up. Do you accept, and by the way, there's two equals of lawyers, which is John Roberts and Lord Laws, I believe it was, I can't remember, or it might be Lord Judge. They're having a conversation about the Magna Carta in America, and they actually say what caused the American War of Independence was that the people there stood up and said, we want the same rights as an Englishman. And it was the British, not the English, the British, in 1776, bearing in mind that it was only created in 1706, 1707, then attacked their very countrymen.
Well, it was Hessian troops, wasn't it? And it's only in recent years I found out the dark side of the Williamite settlement and the importing of Dutchmen in this new creation. This was still before the Union of Parliaments, but at the stage of the Union of Crowns, they were already trying to forge England and Scotland into something else for the interest of Dutch banking at one level. So absolutely, I agree with that. And the use of Hessian troops 70 years later in North America is another part of that agenda.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, so again, it looks like we're agreeing quite a bit. The bit that we're not going to be agreeing on, and so I believe that we need to move on to this as a specific, right? You must also understand, if you rip up the Acts of Union, not only do you solve the Agenda 2030, you completely, and it's not for me to say, what I'm going to say is you've used the words, you're using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. I don't believe that's true. And the reason for that is simple, right? This has been a multi-generational attack on our Constitution, because our Constitution and the American Constitution stands in the way of complete tyranny.
Particularly the right to keep and bear arms, which, the big secret is that we still have it. This is one area in which you particularly are right. Scotsmen do not have a codification of their God-given and common law right to keep and bear arms, because it's not in the Claim of Right 1689, but it is in the English Bill of Rights 1689.
Correct. Right. So let me just say this to you. Not only does it tear up any stitch up of England and the other nations of this country, and there's some things people don't even realise that the Isle of Man, wasn't even in the European Union. It remained completely independent.
Tell me about it. My dad was an offshore banker before he came to his senses in Jersey 30 years ago, and he found at some point he and in fact me as his whatever 11-year-old son at that point were being threatened with unspeakable things by some of those bastards. Yeah. So I know what goes on there, and I know that it's often Scotsmen they pull into those banks and they try to turn them to the dark side. A point made by Bill Maloney in his documentary, was it Sun, Sea and Satan, on Jersey, where he said that the place is full of Scots bankers. But what are they hanging on to? It's the corporate crown. I found out recently, Graham, that oddly enough, when the Privy Council does its business regarding the Crown dependencies, the Isle of Man, the Bailiwick of Jersey and the Bailiwick of Guernsey, the sovereign is required not to be present, or at least that was the situation up to the 1960s. Although in the more recent tell-all book by, who was the Liberal Democrats MP who became security minister under Nick Clegg, who I forget the name right now, but he's written a chapter a bit naughty about the Privy Council. Recently, the name will come to me in a moment, but he said in that it seemed to him that the sovereign was by that stage still sitting there when Jersey, Guernsey and Manx business was conducted, but something extremely murky is going on with those crown dependencies. And over here on the continent, you hear incessantly, and the Dutch, by the way, do it too with the Netherlands Antilles, your crown keeps those colonies so that you can make an absolute fortune in, it's unspeakable stuff. It's child sex, it's drugs. That's what goes through those countries ultimately. That's why there's death threats for anyone who finds out what's going on. Well,
I'm not going to disagree with that, is the answer. I do know that obviously one of the things that angers me more than anything else is any offence against children. Paedophilia is rife, and it's been rife in the European Union. You can go back to the, and I'm sure you're aware of this. There was a Belgian guy, Mark.
Are you thinking of Marc Dutroux, the child rapist, or are you thinking about the mayor who's recently slotted?
No, the one before that, and you pronounce it perfectly.
Marc Dutroux.
That's it. Don't expect me to pronounce it like that.
I've got the Dutch original, which is very hard to get, of the X report. Plus, in a separate list, the identities of Mr. X1 to X10 from another source. So I know exactly how high up this goes, yes.
Yeah, and it goes right the way up the chain into the European Union. It comes over there as well, because it's one of the reasons why they love open borders. There's lots of different things going on in the background. if people really knew what happened in Belgium and what it was linked to, people over here would stop voting for the Tories, the Lib Dems, and etc. You've just mentioned a Liberal Democrat who just happened to be in defence. Was you aware that Vince Cable, for example, was, I wouldn't say prosecuted, but sued in the United States of America with Royal Dutch Shell, and Royal Dutch Shell settled in the courts of America because Vince Cable and others was on the board of Royal Dutch Shell, and 9 human rights activists in Nigeria were executed because of their involvement with the tyrannous president at the time.
That is a detail that had escaped me, but it doesn't surprise me. The book, by the way, is called And What Do You Do by Norman Baker. If you recall him, he's done some good, valuable services. He's a latter-day Tony Benn in some ways.
Yeah.
And Norman Baker's got a whole chapter in there, plus an appendix about the Privy Council, including the full text in an appendix of the document, which when you receive, you're told to burn, which tells you what oaths you'll be making to our sovereign lady. But it's the corporate crown, so it's unlawful.
So again, I'm going to go through a few of my list of bits and pieces here. This is not, if you like, an interview. It's a chat because we've got some. So again, tearing up the, and I mean voiding, not repealing. That means...
For those who don't understand, voiding is declaring the law a nullity. It never was law,
exactly.
Which has been done very often in English jurisprudence, saying this was not a law. Yep. It's a completely foreign concept to the civil law continentals.
Yep.
That's why they hate juries, of course.
Yep. And the juries being one of our biggest protections, which is again why the British have removed it largely. And I could go through. I sent you a presentation some time ago, which showed you what the English had given us as rights and what the British had taken away.
Yeah, I mean, with a change of nomenclature from the British to the corporate crown is my favourite phrase. I'm absolutely with you on that. And it puts me in mind of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Soviet dissident. It's very similar in some ways in that the Russian people had, a Christian-based common law, a biblical natural law under the Romanovs. Of course, there were abuses, but that was the situation. Soviet Revolution comes, Bolshevik Revolution to use the proper term, and 50 years after that, Solzhenitsyn's ruminating on what's gone so horribly wrong. And at some point he says, well, we've got to stop thinking that the Soviets, have done this to us, because the population overlap between Russians and Soviets is about as overwhelming as the population overlap between British and English. Over 80% in both cases. So he has passages in the Gulag Archipelago where he says, we were doing this to ourselves. It wasn't a they. But, that's a question of terminology. I know you've made a very good rhetorical point, or I should say strong rhetorical point. I don't agree with it, but a strong rhetorical point of saying the British have done this to us. Well, as Brian Gerrish would say, you've got to know the enemy. You've got to name him. But, all those rights have been taken away. And I've rubbed shoulders with the people who have taken them away. I've been in and out of the Cabinet Office for years, Chatham House. I've got the cold shivers when I've been in certain rooms and people who are above the visible government come in and say, this is the agenda, not what you're being told publicly. Yeah, absolutely. There is a group of people. You mentioned Royal Dutch Shell a moment ago. There's the Club of the Isles, where the British corporate crown and the Dutch corporate crown get together and hobnob over the success of such corporations and how they're going to hide their profits and avoid prosecution. Pilgrims Society is a big one that people are talking about. They're all licensed plunder coming out of the underbelly of a corporate crown, to me. From the Norman conquest onwards. You always get, when a crown is successful and standing on its oath and embodying the sovereignty and prosperity of the nation and its inalienable rights, you always get these lackeys coming along and saying, can I have something that you're not at liberty to promise, like land or perpetual immunity from prosecution. That this and the Church of England say, oh, sorry, we've got our own legal systems, corporation law and or admiralty law and ecclesiastical or canon law, respectively. And we want it written into the Magna Carta that you can't touch us within our bounds, our spheres of influence. And that's still on the statute books. The corporation and the city and the Church of England with their canon law still pretend the right to adjudicate things outside the common law.
And people don't realise that the City of London's Rembrandters still sit in Parliament and can stop any financial law that goes through Parliament. It has to go through them first. And people don't realise that they're sitting there and they can do that. But a Magna
But
Carta...
the key thing there, Graham, is that this remembrance that you're so right to draw attention to is part of the Williamite settlement, 1688, 1689. That is 19 years, 18 if you start the negotiations from 1706, 18, 19 years before the Act of Union. So the Rot had come into England a generation before the Act of the Union of Parliaments. It's a historical debate, obviously, whether it was an inevitability after William III came over, whether we would end up with a Union of Parliaments. Certainly the Dutch no-good boyos that he brought with him, like Bentinck, who became a leading Whig later, they definitely had plans to turn us into something on the international stage that wasn't in our own interests or in line with our common law. But at the time of the Act of Union, it was the Scots that were protesting in the way that you now are, Graham. It was the Scots who were saying, a parcel of rogues in a nation sold us out, bought and sold for English gold. The Act of Union was very nearly overturned at the popular and judicial level north of the border in 1709.
Well, it was
the same year as the first Jacobite uprising. So, your argument seems to be that the British came and clobbered England by bringing about parts of the Williamite settlement and then the Act of Union.
So let me. My argument is this, and I want you to completely understand what I'm saying. When this started, right? When the British started to attack the English, right? And I'll tell you exactly when in history it was. In 1776, the Americans stood up and said, we want the same rights as the English. The British lost a major colony. Then they come back to these shores and said, how do we continue attacking them and how do we destroy all of the English rights so this never happens again? That's when it started.
You can trace that back, as I did in my talk for Alternative View 9, which is on YouTube now, to the franchise, which was America, even before the continental US was even British colonies. Even when it was English colonies, I should more particularly say, even at the stage when it was still the Portuguese, and before that the Templars claiming that territory. The territory seems to have already been demarcated, with some very interesting boundary stones in Maine and Minnesota and so on, and at the Rio Grande, basically saying this is the future site of a political union. It's extremely interesting. I go into that in AV9. The Templars in particular are, to my mind, show that we have much more, we have deeper roots to seek than the British or the time of the Revolutionary War. I think we're talking here about the Vatican and more the level of the Roman patrician families or the links to the Levant, the Venetians, than we have to do with the Vatican as a church.
I don't disagree with that. But, so, let me just get back to this point. We're talking about the British and when it happened. You've referenced a number of occasions the difference in the time period between the Bill of Rights, 1688-89. There's many people out there that say it was an invasion. My opinion is it was an invasion. There was 3,000 of our soldiers that was with that group.
John Hurst always draws attention to this, that William's most important document is Reasons for Appearing in Arms in England, which is very hard to get hold of course. Yeah. Tells you a thing or two.
Right, so again, I've read through the diaries of the time in the archives and books that are very old, that actually, before you had the brainwashing going on, that tells you and shows you the actual transcript of the diaries at the time, what was said, who said it, etc. And there is no doubt in my mind that this was not an invasion. And the second thing is, for people out there that say he was Dutch, he should never have been a king of England, his wife was English.
Yeah.
Right. So, and again, you're sitting there with windmills behind you. I've got no issues with the Dutch whatsoever. Quite like the Dutch, funny enough, and I think they fight just as well as we do. Right.
They do.
And especially when it's England and
they're the only continentals that really understand us.
I'll tell you,
I get another interesting conversation I had with my dad. A bit older I was at this time, about 14, I think, because we're Christians as well. I asked him why it was that very much of the continent didn't have the Christian liberty that Britain did. And, again, Britain, England and Scotland historically had that Christian liberty and were a place of refuge for political and religious dissidents from all over the continent, such as the Huguenots. And Dad said, this was years before I knew I would marry a Dutch woman, he said, well, not even our closest cousins, the Dutch, completely understood the gospel and individual liberty in the way that we did. The furthest the Dutch got, which is the furthest any of the continentals have got, is halfway. There is a license under the crown for certain communities to be licensed dissidents. And sadly, that attitude came in with the Williamite settlement, because you didn't get a repeal of the requirement to be Anglican. You got an act of toleration, saying, "Well, some of you will never be Anglican, and we'll pretend pretend we don't see that, look the other way." That's all the tolerance there ever was. And when you're talking 17th century, Graham, religious liberty, particularly in the West Country where William landed and had his biggest support, all the gruesome wars going on, and in the killing times at the same time in Scotland. I see it in the Netherlands, being a translator of church history. People were fleeing all over northwestern Europe from one jurisdiction to another at that time, because they ranked their religious liberty and their freedom of conscience above their nationality if they had to make the choice. This is another of the many factors at play in the late 17th century. Is that when William unfurled his banner, it was the order was the Protestant liberties. Sorry, the Protestant religion and liberties of England I will maintain, not the other way around, because that was the order of priority to people then. And what I'm worried about is that you are ultimately setting up a left-wing style, and you hate the left for what they've done, but you're setting up a left-wing style ideological test for nationality. At times you seem almost like advocating civic nationalism, or saying, like you said yesterday, you can be black and English, which you absolutely can, because David and I, and in fact the whole team, Brian and Mike were there as well. We sat at the Grenfell Tower victims meeting that we attempted to help in, and I remember a Caribbean gentleman saying at the top of his voice, we don't want to pursue this, to get a remedy to this under their law, Admiralty law. We want administrative law, he said. We want it under our law, common law. And this was a guy who may have been born in Jamaica, I don't know. Or maybe.
Listen, let me tell you something. My mate is as black as the ace of spades. He's got dreads down to his arse, right? He talks like me, he walks like me, and he thinks like me, and he calls himself English. Right, so yeah. I've got no issues with that. So
I think that the West Indies guys in particular will more often call themselves English than British, and that's particularly. I don't think the Pakistanis do, but the West Indies guys are particularly keen on Englishness as their identity.
And let me just say this to everyone out there, yeah, my mate, yeah, apart from being very good on a motorcycle as well, and very amusing when he starts doing his tricks, even at our age, right, he's more English than Nigel Farage, right? And I don't particularly like Nigel Farage, but let me tell you something, he is more English than Nigel Farage. So people out there, and again, people often refer to me because I'm English that I must be a racist. It's the biggest load of BS and propaganda BS that ever. Now, just briefly, because I've got to jump over to the other channel, I'm going to mention one other. There's a couple of things that I want to mention. First of all, the UK column seems to censor what it wants to talk about. Now, I know it doesn't like the BBC, yeah, but there's another individual that doesn't like the BBC. But seeing as you are a well-versed person and a well-read person, have you ever read or do you know of a person called, he's an author called Tom Holland?
Oh, yes. Yes, he's written a number of excellent books, Persian Fire and one on the origin of Islam.
Right. So the next
thing... I've got an authored copy of his Persian Fire, actually.
Right. So the question I've got for you, and you can take this back to Brian Gerrish, and this is for the UK column, yeah? I often get accused of slagging off Tommy Robinson, right? In my opinion, nobody is beyond criticism, and if it's constructive criticism, that's how we judge ourselves and learn.
Yeah.
Right? Same as me being on a motorcycle, an advanced motorcycling course, and people telling me you're not doing this right, you're not doing that right, and I've been riding a motorcycle for years and years and years. But you've got to accept someone who's better than you saying you're doing this wrong, and you need to change it. Right? So you change your habit of a lifetime. Right? And let me just say this to you. There is the book, and I have read it.
Yeah.
It's called In the Shadow of the Sword. And like you said, this is about the history of Islam. But
Yeah.
it was written by Tom Holland.
I'm a very keen student of the history of Islam, and he was censored quite heavily for it. We're running out of time, but Brian is very prepared to talk to you specifically about grooming gangs.
All right.
He's very prepared to do that, and he's not quite as theologically versed as I am, but he's no slacker there either. But separately or together with Brian, I'd be very glad to talk about Islam with you.
Yeah, well, again, we'll come back on that one. I've got to jump over to the other one. But the main point is, yeah, that guy's documentary ended up being banned on Channel 4, and they wouldn't air it because they was frightened of the backlash in this country, which I find to be disgusting. But let me just say something to Brian Gerrish, UK column, and yourself, yeah? The British never put this man in prison, and they did Tommy Robinson. And the only reason they put Tommy Robinson in jail, the British, is because he's not one of the elites. And he doesn't speak the way they want him to speak. And he won't be edited, and he won't self-censor, right? But Tom Holland, yeah, has never been sent to prison for this and for what he said, and he's told the truth about Islam.
I'll leave you with a closing thought, Graham.
You can indeed.
It's Trafalgar Square. It's Trafalgar Day. And David Scott tweeted this out earlier today. A third of the sailors, more than a third of the captains, all the ship's surgeons, and everyone present when Nelson died were Scottish. It is absolutely a great moment in British history when we stood alone and prevailed. And that was the same day when Nelson said, England expects that every man shall do his duty. Yeah. I take that as a firm data point that England and Britain were in many ways interchangeable concepts, even as early as 1805.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that, Phil. And I will look forward to you coming on again. Brian Gerrish is welcome. And like I say, last night, obviously, you was in the chat. I didn't know whether you was a troll or not. And
that's no offence taken. It can happen. There are a lot of trolls and impersonators.
I even have myself in there sometimes, and I'm wondering if I'm talking to myself or not. So.
And finally, thank you very much for being instrumental in proving that magistrates' courts are not courts, but in fact, JPs, Justices of the Peace, are officers of the executive. Yeah. And if you say to them you're not judges and this is not a constitutional court, you find out what happens in your case. So well done for that.
Thank you. And again, everybody out there, this is Alex Thompson from, or a contributor, I should say, to UK column, and it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you. Anytime, Graham.
Thank you.
Night.
Be lucky. Right, let me go to this. So I'm hoping everyone enjoyed that. This is going to keep running for a little bit on Alex's side until I shut it down. I've got to go to the 5x5 side. I don't even know how many people was watching. Thank you to everyone, and I'm hoping we did it justice. I will persuade Alex that the British need to be completely... You've got to understand your enemy. I understand the enemy. Many other people understand the enemy. And I've got to say this. Robin Tilbrook has put his head above the parapet so many times. There is now another judicial review in, yeah? And let me tell you something, he's putting everything at risk, yeah? Literally. Because the British will do to him exactly what they've done to Tommy Robinson unless we stand up and we back him and we get behind it. That's it. Be lucky, people. I am now off. Don't forget what I believe in. The Constitution is the solution. And I will see you on the other side. If you're going to 5x5, go up there and I will see you then.